The dull, abrupt thud of the auctioneer's wooden gavel echoed across the dusty gravel lot, as if momentarily tearing through the dense, tightly strained silence of Jasper County. In that heavy, vibrating sound, there was not a single drop of mercy, only a dry, inevitable statement of fact. Under a pale Iowa sky covered by an uneven veil of clouds, dozens of people had gathered, their lives and destinies compressed into this leaden June day. They were all here, desperate local farmers in faded white denim overalls with calloused, earth-ingrained hands. Bank clerks and respectable lawyers in pressed navy blue suits, their shoes gleaming with polish against the rural mud. Petty flippers nervously rubbing their palms together, and major land investors who had arrived with a single purpose: to strip the exhausted province to the bone. "We will start the bidding at an opening price of $180,000, the auctioneer shouted over the howl of the wind, standing on a wooden platform knocked together right in the farm's backyard. Numbered paddles shot into the air instantly, like a flock of frightened birds. The figures climbed at such a dizzying speed that most of those present quickly lost count. 190, 200, 220. Every step taken by the auctioneer felt like a targeted strike against a living body. In the very last row of the crowd, almost at the edge of the dented old fence, stood a woman. She seemed an outsider at this feast of financial marauding. She wore an old, faded denim jacket, evidently taken from someone else's shoulder, and a simple, dark skirt. Her thin lips were pressed into a narrow, bloodless line, and her knuckles were white from unbearable tension. In her hands, held just below her waist, she tightly clutched a small brown paper envelope. Inside lay exactly $500, not a cent more. Hardly anyone in this agitated, greedy, or fear-stricken crowd paid any attention to her. It wouldn't have crossed the minds of any of the dealers present that this pale woman, withered by grief, had come here to bid. But before long, every single person at this auction would remember her name forever. To understand how she ended up here, with $500 in her pocket against the multi-million-dollar capital of big business, you have to turn back the hands of time. You have to return several weeks into the past, to where hope was fading on the depleted fields with every unpaid bill that arrived in the mail. The spring of 1984 arrived in Jasper County, Iowa, with a heavy, damp delay. At this time of year, the endless, rolling fields should have been humming with the steady rumble of heavy tractors preparing the rich, deep black soil for planting. But in the spring of '84, most of the land lay untouched, silent, and dead. Like a prolonged, scorching drought, the American farm crisis of the 1980s drained the financial life out of virtually every home in the county. Loan interest rates skyrocketed into insane double digits, while grain and livestock prices crashed to rock bottom. The banks, themselves teetering on the verge of collapse, demanded the immediate repayment of debts with cold-blooded cruelty, debts that people simply had no way to pay. Every week along the dusty gravel roads, like poisonous mushrooms after a toxic rain, new freshly painted wooden signs sprouted with the short, terrifying word, auction. For the families who had worked this land for 3 or 4 generations, these signs meant far more than just the loss of property. They signaled the collapse of a family legacy, the complete erasure of memory, and the trampling of human dignity. On a modest 160-acre plot near the town of Newton lived 34-year-old Sarah Whitmore with her 2 children, 10-year-old Emily and 8-year-old Jacob. Just 3 years ago, these fields had echoed with the bright, booming laughter of her husband, Thomas. Thomas possessed a remarkable, unshakable faith in the land. He always said that even the harshest, fiercest winter would inevitably yield to a thaw. One only needed to know how to wait and work. But a tragic farm accident, an old tractor jumping its handbrake on a steep incline, cut his life short in an instant, leaving Sarah alone against a harsh, unforgiving reality. From that fateful day on, Sarah became everything at once to her children: mother, father, accountant, mechanic, and manager of a crumbling homestead. Her neighbors genuinely admired her resilience, her unyielding courage, but human admiration could not stop the snowballing interest on bank loans. Every morning, long before the first rays of the cold sun broke through the pre-dawn fog, Sarah was already on her feet. She milked the remaining dairy cows, cooked a modest breakfast for the children, and headed out to the fields on an old, constantly sputtering tractor. With every passing season, the fields seemed wider, heavier, and harsher. Working them properly required diesel fuel, fertilizer, and new parts, resources she simply did not have. In the evenings, after the children were tucked into bed, Sarah would sit at the heavy kitchen table. Under the dim, yellow glow of a desk lamp, she spent hours sorting through stacks of overdue bills, counting cents, looking for any way out of this financial dead end. During the day, she held on with all her strength for the sake of the children, smiling at them and assuring them that everything would be all right. But the children noticed far more than she thought. 10-year-old Emily quietly stopped asking for new school dresses, neatly mending her old outfits instead. And 8-year-old Jacob suggested one evening that he skip school lunches so Mom and Emily could have more food. Sarah would smile, hug them, and then, once the children were asleep, cry softly on the porch, hiding her face in hands bitten to the bone. Then came that rainy, bleak day when the mailman delivered another registered letter bearing an official blue stamp. She didn't even need to open the flat paper envelope to know what was hidden inside. First National Bank was issuing a final notice of foreclosure proceedings. Unless the entire accumulated debt was paid in full within 30 calendar days, the Whitmore farm would be put up for public auction. Sarah reread the dry, typewritten letter 3 times, not because it was hard to parse the cold legal jargon, but because her mind desperately refused to accept the terrifying thought: the labor of 3 generations of the Whitmore family, the sweat shed by her father-in-law, Thomas's youth, and her own sleepless nights could be wiped away by a single short paragraph on official letterhead. She neatly folded the paper along its crease lines and tucked it into the very drawer of the wooden desk where dozens of other warnings were already lying. A second later, when Emily walked softly into the kitchen, Sarah forced a smile with great effort. "Is everything okay, Mom?" the girl asked quietly, searching her mother's pale face. "Yes, sweetheart. Just another electric bill," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Emily desperately wanted to believe her mother, but she couldn't miss the solitary tears Sarah hadn't managed to wipe from her cheek in time. That same night, a thick, tangible fog settled over the farm, smelling of damp earth and rotting grass. Finishing her chores and milking the cattle, Sarah stood for a long time in the dim gloom of the old wooden barn. She slowly ran her palm over the massive support beam made of stained oak, the very one Thomas had reinforced with his own hands a couple of years before the tragedy. "I don't know how to handle this anymore, Thomas," she whispered into the ringing silence. Her only answer was the faint, mournful whistle of the wind pushing through the gaps in the plank walls. A week later, the local bank branch manager, Harold Benson, drove out to the farm in person. Harold was neither a cruel nor a heartless man. Born and raised in these parts, he knew the story of every family, knew the hell people endured when losing their homes. But strict banking policies left him without the slightest room to maneuver. "The auction is set for June 18th, he said softly, avoiding direct eye contact. "I'm truly sorry, Sarah." Sarah looked past his shoulder, out toward the distant hills where Thomas had once taught little Jacob how to hold the steering wheel of a light tractor. "Harold, there has to be another way. We were reliable customers for so many years." "I've exhausted every legal option," Benson sighed, lowering his head. "My hands are tied by instructions from Chicago." After his car vanished over the crest of the hill in clouds of gravel dust, Sarah remained standing on the driveway for a long time. The children watched her from the porch, not daring to break the heavy silence hanging in the air. The news of the impending sale of the Whitmore land spread through Jasper County like wildfire. In the local diner, over cups of cheap black coffee, farmers endlessly debated which major players would show up at the auction. One name came up more often than the rest: Richard Hawthorne. Hawthorne was the largest landowner in the county, a man of cold calculation and nearly unlimited financial resources. Over the past 2 years, he had systematically bought up bankrupt farms, consolidating them into a massive agricultural empire. Some admired his business acumen, while others hated him for profiting off other people's misery. But everyone agreed on one thing. If Hawthorne set his sights on a plot, outbidding him was impossible. When Sarah learned that Hawthorne intended to participate in the auction, her last hope for a miracle died. She understood that no ordinary local farmer could stand against his capital. And yet, every evening before bed, she, Emily, and Jacob walked their property together. They paused at the old apple tree Thomas had planted on his daughter's birthday, visited the small pond where Jacob had caught his first perch, admired the tall red barn her grandfather had built back in 1937. Every corner of this land held living memory. To sell it felt like nothing short of betraying that memory. On Saturday, while sorting through things in her husband's old workshop, Sarah accidentally nudged a box on the top shelf. Behind it, she found a dusty metal container. Inside were old checks, family photos, and a small, worn envelope. On it, written in Thomas's familiar sweeping handwriting, was, "For Sarah." Her heart stopped. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope. Inside was a short note. "If you are reading this, it means life has taken another turn we didn't plan for. Please, never measure your worth by the number of acres we own. The land only matters because of the people who live on it. Promise me that you will continue to believe in people, even when life gives you 1,000 reasons not to." Beneath the folded piece of paper lay 5 brand-new, crisp $100 bills. Thomas had set this money aside many years ago for the direst emergency. Sarah handled the bills reverently. $500, a laughable amount. It wasn't even enough to cover a single month's interest, let alone save the farm from auction. And yet at that moment, it felt as though Thomas had reached out his hand across time to remind her she was not alone. She neatly tucked the money back into the envelope. She had no clear plan, but at that exact moment, she made up her mind. This money would not go toward everyday needs. It meant something incomparably greater. The morning of June 18th broke through the heavy curtain of fog, creeping slowly across the gentle hills of Jasper County. Sarah Whitmore had barely closed her eyes that night. Long before dawn, she stood on the porch, holding a cup of black coffee that had gone cold, without her taking a single sip. That morning, her home farm looked different to her, not because the fields or the dilapidated house had changed, but because of a cold, sticky feeling. She might be looking at these dew-washed lands as their rightful owner for the last time. Inside the house, a ringing, almost reverent silence reigned. The children woke early without any prompting. 10-year-old Emily silently made her bed, carefully smoothing every crease on the bedspread, while 8-year-old Jacob quietly packed his humble treasures into a small cardboard box. A favorite toy tractor, a worn baseball glove, and the yellowed family photo in a wooden frame. Neither of the children asked where they would go when it was all over. Children sense adult pain acutely, and often accept harsh truths far sooner than adults dare to speak them aloud. Sarah walked into the house, barely holding back the tears welling up in her throat. "It's time, kids," she said softly. "We need to go." She stepped up to the kitchen table, pulled out the drawer, and took out Thomas's envelope. 5 crisp $100 bills. Sarah slipped it into the inner pocket of her faded denim jacket. Not because she believed this money could buy back the land, but because the envelope gave her a physical feeling. Thomas was walking this path beside her. By 8 in the morning, the gravel lot near the Whitmore house was packed with pickups, sedans, and even light commercial trucks. The sale of the farm had turned into the main public event for the whole county. The mood in the crowd was mixed and heavy. Local farmers huddled in small groups by their old vehicles, quietly talking about the crash in grain prices and the impending drought. Bank representatives arranged official documents under a white canvas awning. Off to the side stood visiting investors in polished shoes that clearly showed they had never walked through fresh rural mud in their lives. Some came to snatch a piece of fertile land for a pittance. Others came to witness someone else's ultimate downfall. When Sarah stepped out of the old pickup alongside Emily and Jacob, the noise and conversation in the crowd instantly died down. Men began taking off their hats and caps in silence. Old man Collins, whose farm had bordered the Whitmore's property for over 40 years, slowly walked up to Sarah. Heavy, deep sorrow filled his eyes. "I am deeply sorry it's come to this, Sarah," he said in a strained voice. "Me too, Mr. Collins." Sarah forced herself to smile back. The old man reached into his pocket and held out a shiny silver dollar to little Jacob. "Your grandfather gave me this many years ago when I helped him fix his old combine. I think it should belong to you now." Jacob looked at his mother, received her encouraging nod, and carefully accepted the gift. At that moment, a procession of shiny black cars pulled onto the lot. The atmosphere instantly grew tense. From the lead sedan stepped Richard Hawthorne, a tall, imposing man in an expensive, custom-tailored coat. He carried himself with the cold confidence of someone accustomed to considering any piece of real estate his own before the ink had even dried on the document. He was accompanied by 2 lawyers, a financial advisor, and an assistant carrying bulging folders. Hawthorne didn't even grant the Whitmore family a passing glance. To him, this was not a human tragedy. It was just another profitable transaction, a line item in the report on expanding his agricultural empire. "Well, that's that," one investor whispered to his colleague. "Nobody goes up against Hawthorne. Word is he has no ceiling on his bids today." Sarah heard those words, but she kept standing tall. A single purpose was rooted deep inside her: to walk this path to the very end with her head held high. At 9 in the morning, the auctioneer mounted the wooden platform. His loud, trained voice sliced through the morning air. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the public auction for the property of the Whitmore family." Those words echoed in Sarah's heart with sharp pain. Not plot number 4, not agricultural unit, but specifically, the property of the Whitmore family. Up for bid is a plot of 160 acres, including the residential home, dairy barn, grain storage, and water rights. We start the bidding at the sum of $180,000. Bidding paddles shot upward immediately. 190, 200, 210. The figures climbed with frightening speed. Each price increase resonated in Sarah's soul as if a brick were being torn from her house. Jacob squeezed her hand tightly, while Emily stared unblinkingly at her bedroom window, trying to imprint it on her memory forever. Very quickly, only 4 players remained in the game: Richard Hawthorne, a large agro firm from Des Moines, a land syndicate, and an elderly local farmer named Walter Jenkins, who dreamed of expanding land for his sons. But when the price crossed the $300,000 threshold, Walter sighed heavily and lowered his paddle. He couldn't compete with the giants. Soon the other corporations surrendered as well. Only Hawthorne remained. $360,000, the auctioneer shouted. $360,000. Who will give more? A dead silence fell over the crowd. The firm's representative shook his head and lowered his number. $360,000 once, shouted the auctioneer, raising the heavy wooden gavel. $360,000 twice. Sarah closed her eyes. And in that very instant, as the gavel hung suspended in the air, her voice, dry yet remarkably clear and ringing, pierced the silence. "Excuse me." Every eye in the crowd turned to Sarah instantly. Astonishment, confusion, and embarrassment washed over the faces of the people. She took a few confident, heavy steps forward, walking around the outer edge of the hushed onlookers. "I would like permission to ask one question before the auction is closed," she said, maintaining a remarkable, almost otherworldly composure. The auctioneer hesitated for a second, glancing uncertainly at the bank representatives. Harold Benson gave a short, restrained nod. "You may ask your question, Sarah." Sarah looked straight into the auctioneer's eyes. "If someone wants to place a bid, are they required to pay the full amount in its entirety today?" The investors exchanged glances. A few young clerks from major firms offered condescending smiles. The auctioneer replied in the practiced tone of a professional. "No, Mrs. Whitmore. According to the rules, only a guaranteed registration deposit is required today." The remaining balance is paid within the time frames established by the official purchase agreement. Richard Hawthorne allowed himself a barely perceptible contemptuous smirk. He was certain that the widowed woman simply didn't understand the basic financial mechanics of a public auction. Sarah slowly reached her hand into the inner pocket of her denim jacket. She pulled out Thomas's brown envelope, pressed it to her chest for a moment as if seeking invisible support, and said, "I have $500. In the back rows, where young assistants to the investors stood, scattered chuckles broke out. Someone joked out loud, "She thinks $500 can buy a whole farm." "This isn't a charity bazaar," another chimed in. Sarah didn't even turn toward the noise. There was not a trace of embarrassment or shame in her posture. She stubbornly held her gaze on the auctioneer. "I understand perfectly well that this is not enough to buy back the farm, but is it enough to register me as a bidder?" The giggles in the crowd died instantly. Harold Benson adjusted his glasses, hurriedly shuffled through the papers on his table, and nodded. "The minimum registration fee is tied to a fixed percentage of the starting price. $500 covers that threshold. Technically, yes, you have every right to receive a bidder paddle." The crowd froze in stunned silence. Nobody had anticipated such a turn of events. Hawthorne frowned slightly. The clerk accepted the envelope from Sarah, recorded her details, and handed her a plastic paddle with the number 27. Emily looked at her mother with unhidden admiration. "Mom, I told you, sweetheart. Your father always believed the main thing was to fight until the very end," Sarah answered softly. $360,000, the auctioneer reconfirmed. "Will there be a step forward?" Sarah slowly, with uncanny resolve, raised paddle number 27. A collective gasp of surprise swept through the lot. The auctioneer blinked in astonishment. $365,000. Richard Hawthorne turned his head sharply. In his eyes, astonishment quickly gave way to cold irritation. He jerked his paddle upward. 370. Sarah raised her number again. 375. Whispers and a low rumble flooded the crowd. People looked at each other, unable to believe their own ears. What is she doing? Where did she get that kind of money? Has she lost her mind? Hawthorne motioned for his lawyer. "Find out who is backing her, which bank is extending her a credit line." The lawyer slipped through the crowd, made a couple of quick phone calls, and returned 3 minutes later looking utterly bewildered. "Nobody. She came alone. There are no creditors or major investors behind her." "Then why does she keep driving the price up?" Hawthorne hissed through his teeth. Meanwhile, the price crossed $400,000, an amount no reasonable appraiser would have given for the plot. Local farmers smiled quietly into their mustaches. For the first time in years, someone was making Richard Hawthorne lose his composure and pay triple for every acre. But Sarah wasn't raising her paddle to win the auction. She was buying time. Deep in her heart, she was praying for only one thing: that the person she had sent a letter to 3 days ago would make it in time. And at the exact moment the auctioneer announced, $430,000, and Hawthorne raised the price to $435 without hesitation, a thick cloud of dust billowed at the far end of the gravel road. A vehicle was approaching the lot at breakneck speed. An old, dust-covered white Ford pickup truck, pulling a massive livestock trailer behind it, screeched to a halt right at the edge of the awning. A tall, broad-shouldered man in worn overalls stepped out of the cab. He took off his cap and surveyed the gathering. The older farmers recognized him instantly. "Is that David Miller?" It can't be. David Miller had grown up in these parts, but 15 years ago he had left for Nebraska. Once, he and Thomas Whitmore had been inseparable friends. In Nebraska, David had built a successful business repairing and restoring farm machinery, helping bankrupt farmers get back on their feet. David walked quickly up to Sarah. Tears welled in her eyes. "You made it." "I gave Thomas my word that I would never leave his family in trouble," David replied softly. He turned to the auctioneer and pulled an old, yellowed envelope from his jacket pocket. "Forgive my tardiness. I have a document directly relevant to today's bidding." Harold Benson took the paper. It was a mutual partnership assistance agreement signed by Thomas Whitmore and David Miller back in 1979. Benson's eyes went wide. Good heavens! According to this agreement, Harold read aloud, in the event of a threat of land foreclosure against either family due to the death of the primary breadwinner, the surviving partner holds the right of first refusal to buy out the land at a fixed appraised value prior to any public auction. The document was notarized, but due to administrative oversight, it had never entered the main bank registry. Hawthorne's lawyers rushed to examine the paper. 5 minutes later, one of them gloomily whispered to his boss, "The document is authentic. He has the right of first refusal." "And what is the buyout price under this 79 agreement?" Hawthorne asked through gritted teeth. $220,000, Benson replied. David Miller immediately pulled a certified cashier's check from his pocket and handed it to the manager. "Here's the full amount, down to the last cent." The auctioneer's wooden gavel struck the table with a dull, victorious crack. "Sold!" The crowd erupted into deafening applause. Emily and Jacob threw their arms around their mother's neck with tears in their eyes. The Whitmore farm was saved. But the story didn't end there. David walked up to Sarah and handed her the deeds. "The farm is yours again. Many years ago, Thomas pulled my family out of hopeless poverty and gave me the money to start my first business. He refused to take interest and said, 'Someday, you'll help someone else.' I've waited 12 years for this day." Then David turned to the quieted farmers and pointed to his trailer. "I brought more than just a check. Inside this trailer are restored generators, spare parts, and plows. My company is donating them free of charge to the 5 most needy homesteads in the county for the start of the season." Old man Walter Jenkins took the first step forward. "I'll lend my combine to harvest the crops on Sarah's fields. And I'll provide seeds and fuel," another farmer shouted. "I'll help fix the fence," a third chimed in. Within minutes, stern people worn down by life's hardships, who had been ready to resign themselves to the death of their own farms, united into a single, unbreakable force. Even Richard Hawthorne, who had silently observed this chain reaction of human mercy, walked up to Harold Benson and said softly, "I am withdrawing my bids on the remaining bankruptcy cases in this county, and I want to establish a private relief fund to support local family farms, without any publicity." Months passed. The autumn of 1984 brought Jasper County one of the richest harvests in its history. Life hummed on the Whitmore fields once again. The old barn received a new roof, and in the evenings, bright children's laughter rang out from the porch once more. On a crisp October evening, Sarah stood by Thomas's favorite apple tree, watching the setting sun paint the harvested fields in golden hues. She pulled that worn envelope containing the $500 from her pocket. The money was never spent. But it had accomplished something incomparably greater. It had brought people together and reminded everyone in the county that the highest value on this earth is measured not in acres or dollars, but in loyalty, memory, and the willingness to lend a helping hand in the darkest hour.